The morning sun cast long shadows across Nellis Air Force Base as Captain Maria Santos sat in the cramped waiting area outside Colonel Richardson's office, her weathered hands clasped tightly around a steaming cup of black coffee. At 42, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had survived 3 combat deployments and countless training exercises that would have broken lesser pilots. Her dark hair was pulled back in regulation style, though a few gray strands had begun to appear at her temples, battle scars from years of high stress, missions, and sleepless nights spent perfecting her craft. The olive-drab flight suit she wore bore the faded patches of units she'd served with over the past 18 years, each one telling a story of dedication and sacrifice that few in the modern Air Force truly understood. Maria's reputation preceded her wherever she went, though not always in ways that helped her career advancement. She was known throughout the fighter-pilot community as someone who got results, but also as someone who wasn't afraid to challenge authority when she believed lives were at stake. Her direct communication style and unwillingness to sugarcoat tactical assessments had earned her a series of efficiency reports that praised her flying skills, while noting concerns about her interpersonal dynamics and resistance to institutional changes. The younger pilots respected her expertise, but the administrative officers found her difficult to manage, especially when she questioned new protocols or training methodologies that she believed were inferior to proven combat-tested approaches. Her current assignment at Nellis had been sold to her as an opportunity to share her combat experience with the next generation of fighter pilots, but Maria quickly discovered that her role was more ceremonial than substantive. The base's leadership seemed more interested in having a decorated female combat veteran visible in promotional materials than actually utilizing her tactical knowledge in meaningful ways. She found herself relegated to routine training, flights with inexperienced pilots, while the more challenging and important missions were assigned to officers with better political connections but less actual combat experience. The frustration of watching preventable mistakes occur during training exercises, knowing that her input could have prevented them, had begun to wear on her patience in ways that were becoming increasingly difficult to hide. The door to Colonel Richardson's office opened with a sharp click, and his aide gestured for Maria to enter. Colonel James Richardson was a career officer who had built his reputation on running efficient operations and maintaining excellent relationships with his superiors at the Pentagon. At 55, he had silver hair that was always perfectly groomed and a uniform that never showed a wrinkle, even at the end of long days. His office walls were covered with photographs of him shaking hands with various generals and politicians, along with certificates recognizing his administrative achievements. Richardson had never seen combat, having spent his career in logistics and training commands, but he compensated for this gap by maintaining strict adherence to regulations and procedures that he believed represented the pinnacle of military professionalism. "Captain Santos," Richardson said without looking up from the paperwork spread across his desk, "please have a seat." Maria settled into the uncomfortable metal chair facing his desk, noting the way he continued reviewing documents for several more seconds before acknowledging her presence. It was a power play she had encountered many times before, designed to establish hierarchy and make the subordinate feel uncertain about their standing. She waited patiently, her expression neutral, having learned long ago that displaying irritation during these encounters only provided ammunition for those looking to find fault with her attitude. When Richardson finally looked up, his expression was a mixture of disappointment and barely concealed frustration. He opened a thick manila folder that Maria recognized as her personnel file, its contents representing nearly 2 decades of service that had included both remarkable achievements and ongoing conflicts with various commanders who found her approach challenging. "Captain, we need to discuss your performance during yesterday's training exercise," he began, his tone carrying the weight of formal disapproval. "According to the after-action report submitted by Major Williams, you openly contradicted his tactical decisions during the mission debrief, and made statements that undermined his authority in front of junior pilots. Maria felt the familiar surge of frustration that accompanied these conversations, knowing that her analysis of the training exercise had been accurate, but also knowing that accuracy wasn't always valued as highly as protocol in the current military environment. Major Williams was a competent administrator, but had never flown combat missions, and his tactical understanding was largely theoretical, based on classroom instruction rather than the hard-earned lessons that came from actual warfare. During the previous day's exercise, he had made several decisions that would have resulted in aircraft losses in a real combat situation. But when Maria attempted to explain the practical implications of these choices, she was told that her input was not requested and that she should focus on following rather than leading. "Sir," Maria replied carefully, choosing her words with the precision of someone who had learned that every statement would be scrutinized and potentially used against her. "I provided tactical analysis based on my combat experience when I observed decisions that could have resulted in aircraft losses in actual operational conditions. My intent was to ensure that our pilots received training that would prepare them for real-world scenarios they might encounter in combat zones." She paused, reading Richardson's expression and recognizing the signs of a commander who had already made up his mind about the outcome of this conversation. Richardson's jaw tightened as he flipped through several pages in her file, each movement deliberate and calculated to convey his displeasure with her response. "Captain, this is exactly the kind of behavior that has been documented repeatedly in your efficiency reports. You seem incapable of understanding that questioning the decisions of senior officers, regardless of your personal opinions about their tactics, undermines good order and discipline within the unit." He pulled out a specific document and placed it on the desk between them, angling it so that Maria could read the header that identified it as a formal counseling statement. "This is your third documented incident of insubordination in the past 6 months, Richardson continued, his voice taking on the formal tone of an officer delivering an official reprimand. "The first was when you challenged Captain Peterson's flight plan during the joint training exercise with the Navy, claiming that his approach would result in detection by enemy radar systems. The second was when you refused to endorse the new tactical manual without submitting a detailed critique that questioned fundamental assumptions about modern air combat doctrine." He looked up from the document to meet her eyes directly. "And now this incident with Major Williams, where you publicly disagreed with his tactical assessment in front of subordinate personnel." Maria listened to the recitation of her alleged offenses while mentally reviewing each incident from her own perspective. In the first case, Captain Peterson's flight plan would indeed have exposed the formation to unnecessary risks, and her subsequent analysis had been proven correct when the exercise controllers confirmed that his approach would have resulted in mission failure in actual combat conditions. The tactical manual she had critiqued contained several recommendations that contradicted proven combat tactics, and her detailed analysis had been based on extensive operational experience that none of the manual's authors possessed. The incident with Major Williams involved her attempt to prevent junior pilots from learning tactical approaches that could get them killed in actual combat situations. "Sir," she said, maintaining her professional composure despite the growing realization that this conversation was not actually about improving training effectiveness or ensuring pilot safety. "In each of these cases, my analysis was based on combat experience and was subsequently proven accurate. My intent has never been to undermine authority, but rather to ensure that our training prepares pilots for the realities they will face in operational environments." She leaned forward slightly, hoping to convey the sincerity of her commitment to the mission rather than personal advancement. Richardson's expression hardened as he closed the folder with a definitive snap that seemed to echo in the small office. "Captain Santos, your problem is that you seem to believe that your combat experience gives you the right to question any decision made by officers who may not have had the same operational background. This attitude is divisive and counterproductive to maintaining unit cohesion. He stood up from his desk and walked to the window overlooking the flight line, where several aircraft were being prepared for the day's training missions. The modern Air Force operates as a team, Richardson continued without turning around, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to having his pronouncements accepted without question. That team includes pilots, administrators, logistics personnel, and commanders who each bring different skills and perspectives to accomplish our mission. When you consistently position yourself as the sole voice of tactical wisdom while dismissing the contributions of others, you create an environment that is toxic to effective leadership development. He turned back to face her, his expression leaving no doubt about his assessment of her attitude and its impact on unit effectiveness. Maria felt the weight of institutional pressure that she had experienced throughout her career, the subtle but persistent message that her expertise was valued only when it aligned with existing organizational preferences and procedures. She had joined the Air Force believing that competence and dedication would be recognized and rewarded, but her experience had taught her that these qualities were often less important than the ability to navigate political relationships and avoid challenging established hierarchies. The younger pilot sought her out privately for tactical advice, recognizing that her experience could help them survive in combat. But the official training curriculum continued to emphasize approaches that she knew from hard experience were inferior to proven alternatives. "Captain," Richardson said as he returned to his desk and opened another folder, "I've decided that a change of environment might help you develop a better appreciation for the importance of working within established systems rather than constantly trying to reform them based on your personal experiences." He pulled out a set of transfer orders that had clearly been prepared before this meeting began. "You're being reassigned to administrative duties with the Training Development Office, effective immediately. This will give you an opportunity to contribute to tactical doctrine development through proper channels while removing you from direct interaction with trainee pilots who might be confused by conflicting guidance." The transfer orders represented exactly what Maria had feared when she received the summons to Richardson's office, a professional exile that would remove her from the work she loved, while providing a face-saving way for the command structure to neutralize what they perceived as a troublesome influence. Administrative duties in the Training Development Office meant spending her days writing reports and attending meetings where her combat experience would be filtered through multiple layers of bureaucracy before having any impact on actual pilot training. It was a career dead end disguised as a lateral move, designed to encourage her to either conform to institutional expectations or seek early retirement. "Sir," Maria said quietly, recognizing that any protest would only strengthen Richardson's conviction that she possessed the attitude problems he had described, "I understand the assignment. When do you expect me to report to the Training Development Office?" She kept her voice level and professional, though inside she felt the familiar mixture of frustration and disappointment that had accompanied similar conversations throughout her career. Richardson seemed almost surprised by her calm acceptance of the reassignment, having perhaps expected an emotional response that would have provided additional justification for his decision. "You'll report to Colonel Martinez on Monday morning," he said, consulting his calendar. "She's expecting you and has been briefed on your background and the circumstances of your transfer." He paused, studying Maria's expression as if trying to determine whether her acquiescence was genuine or simply a tactical maneuver designed to avoid further conflict. As Maria stood to leave Richardson's office, she felt the weight of another professional setback that seemed to follow a pattern she had encountered repeatedly throughout her military career. Her expertise was acknowledged in private conversations and utilized during actual emergencies, but when it came to formal recognition and career advancement, her direct communication style and unwillingness to defer to inferior tactical judgment consistently worked against her. She had watched officers with less experience and fewer qualifications receive promotions and choice assignments, while she remained in positions where her skills were underutilized and her input was actively discouraged. The walk across the base to her quarters gave Maria time to process the morning's events and consider her limited options moving forward. She could accept the administrative assignment and hope that eventually her expertise would be recognized through official channels, though her experience suggested that this approach was unlikely to be successful. Alternatively, she could request a transfer to another unit, though her personnel file would follow her, and likely result in similar conflicts with commanders who valued conformity over competence. The third option, early retirement, would allow her to avoid further professional frustration, but would also mean abandoning the younger pilots, who still needed the tactical knowledge that only combat experience could provide. The training development office occupied a sterile building on the far side of Nellis Air Force Base, deliberately positioned away from the flight line where the actual flying took place. Maria reported to Colonel Elena Martinez on a Monday morning that felt more like a funeral procession than the beginning of a new assignment. The building's interior reflected the bureaucratic nature of its mission. Fluorescent lighting hummed overhead, casting everything in a harsh artificial glow, while beige walls displayed motivational posters featuring generic inspirational quotes about teamwork and excellence. The smell of burnt coffee and industrial carpet cleaner permeated the air, creating an atmosphere that seemed designed to drain enthusiasm from even the most dedicated personnel. Colonel Martinez was a small woman with prematurely gray hair who had built her career on developing training curricula and managing educational programs for various Air Force specialties. She greeted Maria with professional courtesy, but also with the careful distance of someone who had been thoroughly briefed about her new subordinate's reputation for challenging authority. Martinez's office was organized with military precision, featuring color-coded filing systems and multiple computer monitors displaying training schedules, budget spreadsheets, and personnel assignments. Unlike Richardson's wall of political photographs, Martinez's decorations consisted primarily of educational certificates and awards, recognizing her contributions to pilot training methodology. Captain Santos, Martinez began as they settled into chairs around a small conference table laden with thick binders and technical manuals. I've reviewed your background and I want to be clear about expectations for your role here. Your combat experience is valuable, but our mission requires translating that experience into standardized training products that can be consistently delivered across multiple installations. She opened one of the binders to reveal detailed lesson plans with specific learning objectives, assessment criteria, and time allocations for each training module. We don't have the luxury of individual interpretation when it comes to curriculum development. Everything must be measurable, repeatable, and aligned with Air Force-wide training standards. Maria studied the training materials spread before her, immediately recognizing the gulf between standardized classroom instruction and the complex, rapidly evolving challenges that pilots faced in actual combat situations. The lesson plans were meticulously organized and undoubtedly met all administrative requirements for documentation and assessment, but they reduced the dynamic art of tactical decision-making to multiple-choice questions and predefined responses that bore little resemblance to the split-second judgments required in real warfare. The emphasis on standardization had created a system that prioritized consistent delivery over tactical accuracy, ensuring that every pilot received identical instruction regardless of whether that instruction reflected current best practices or outdated theoretical concepts. "Ma'am," Maria said carefully, recognizing that she was walking into exactly the kind of situation that had created problems for her in previous assignments. "I noticed that some of the tactical scenarios in these training modules don't reflect current enemy capabilities or tactics that have proven effective in recent operations. Would there be opportunities to update these materials based on lessons learned from ongoing combat operations?" She pointed to a specific section dealing with surface-to-air missile threats that was based on intelligence assessments that were several years out of date. Martinez's expression tightened slightly, and Maria immediately recognized the familiar signs of a commander who viewed such questions as challenges to established procedures rather than legitimate attempts to improve training effectiveness. Captain, these training materials have been developed through extensive collaboration with subject matter experts from across the Air Force and have been approved at the highest levels of command. While I appreciate your perspective, our role is to implement approved curricula rather than redesign fundamental training approaches based on individual opinions or experiences. The conversation continued for another hour as Martinez walked Maria through her specific responsibilities, which primarily involved reviewing training documentation for formatting errors, coordinating schedules with various base departments, and attending meetings where curriculum changes were discussed but rarely implemented. It became clear that her role was essentially clerical, designed to keep her busy with administrative tasks while ensuring that her tactical expertise had minimal impact on actual pilot training. The irony was not lost on Maria that she was being assigned to develop training materials, while being specifically discouraged from incorporating the combat knowledge that made her uniquely qualified for such work. As the weeks passed, Maria found herself trapped in a professional purgatory that was more frustrating than any combat mission she had ever flown. Her days were consumed with reviewing PowerPoint presentations for font consistency, scheduling conference rooms for meetings she wasn't allowed to meaningfully participate in, and formatting training manuals that contained tactical information she knew to be incorrect or incomplete. The other personnel in the training development office were competent administrators but lacked operational experience, making conversations about tactical effectiveness impossible since they had no frame of reference for evaluating the real-world applicability of the training materials they were producing. The most frustrating aspect of her new assignment was witnessing the development of training scenarios that she knew would inadequately prepare pilots for the threats they would actually face in combat zones. During one particularly painful meeting, she watched a group of training designers develop a surface-to-air missile evasion exercise based on outdated threat assessments and theoretical models that bore no resemblance to the adaptive tactics she had encountered during her deployments. When she attempted to provide input based on actual mission experience, her suggestions were politely noted and then ignored, with meeting leaders explaining that changes to approved training scenarios required extensive review processes that could take months or years to complete. Meanwhile, on the flight line where the real training took place, Maria began hearing disturbing reports from pilots who sought her out during off-duty hours for unofficial tactical advice. The standardized training they were receiving was producing competent pilots who could execute predetermined procedures but who lacked the adaptive thinking skills necessary for survival in rapidly changing combat environments. Young pilots complained that their training scenarios were predictable and formulaic, failing to prepare them for the kind of tactical improvisation that real combat required. They understood the approved procedures, but had no experience with the kind of creative problem-solving that separated surviving pilots from casualties. Lieutenant Sarah Chun, a promising young pilot who had recently completed advanced fighter training, exemplified the challenges facing the newer generation of aviators. During an informal conversation at the base recreation center, Chun confided her concerns about the gap between her training and the operational realities described by returning combat veterans. "Captain Santos," she said quietly, glancing around. To ensure their conversation remained private, "The scenarios we train on are nothing like what the deployed pilots talk about. Everything in training has a textbook solution. But they say real combat is all about adapting when nothing goes according to plan." Maria found herself in the uncomfortable position of wanting to help these young pilots, while being officially prohibited from providing tactical guidance that contradicted approved training methodologies. She could see that they were eager to learn and genuinely concerned about their readiness for combat operations, but her administrative assignment specifically prevented her from conducting any form of unofficial training or tactical instruction. The regulations were clear. All pilot training must be conducted through official channels using approved curricula, and any unauthorized instruction could result in disciplinary action for both the instructor and the students involved. The situation became even more frustrating when Major Williams, the same officer whose training exercise had led to Maria's transfer, was promoted to lieutenant colonel and assigned as the new deputy commander of training operations. Williams had no combat experience but had earned recognition for his ability to manage training schedules efficiently and maintain high marks on administrative inspections. His promotion was celebrated by the base leadership as an example of the kind of professional development that resulted from focusing on institutional requirements rather than individual expertise. During one of the regular staff meetings that Maria was required to attend, Williams presented his new initiatives for improving training efficiency through increased standardization and reduced variation in instructional methods. "Our goal," he announced to the assembled training staff, "is to achieve complete predictability in training outcomes by eliminating subjective elements that can lead to inconsistent pilot performance." He outlined plans for replacing instructor-led tactical discussions with computer-based training modules that would ensure every pilot received identical instruction regardless of which base they attended or which instructors they encountered. Maria listened to this presentation with growing alarm, recognizing that Williams was proposing to remove precisely the elements of training that develop the adaptive thinking skills pilots needed for combat survival. Computer-based modules could teach basic procedures and regulations, but they could not simulate the stress, uncertainty, and rapid decision-making requirements that characterized actual combat operations. The proposal essentially reduced pilot training to a series of predetermined responses to predetermined situations, creating pilots who would be helpless when faced with scenarios that didn't match their programmed expectations. When the presentation concluded, and Williams asked for questions or comments, Maria faced a familiar dilemma. She knew that her expertise could help prevent the implementation of training changes that would ultimately cost lives, but she also knew that speaking up would be interpreted as another example of her inability to work within established systems. The other meeting attendees waited expectantly, some probably hoping that she would remain silent to avoid creating the kind of conflict that had become associated with her presence at such gatherings. "Sir," Maria said finally, deciding that her responsibility to future pilots outweighed her concern about personal consequences, "I'm concerned that reducing tactical training to computer-based modules might not adequately prepare pilots for the kind of adaptive decision-making they'll need in actual combat situations. Combat operations often require rapid responses to unexpected situations that don't match predetermined scenarios." She kept her tone respectful and professional, though she could see Williams's expression hardening as she spoke. Williams's response was swift and decisive, clearly designed to establish his authority while dismissing her concerns in front of the assembled staff. "Captain Santos, your resistance to modernization and standardization has been well documented. While I appreciate that you have operational experience, our training programs are designed by teams of experts who consider far more factors than individual combat anecdotes." He paused for emphasis, ensuring that everyone in the room understood the hierarchy being established. "The computer-based modules I'm proposing have been extensively tested and have proven more effective than traditional instructor-led training at producing consistent outcomes." The meeting continued for another 30 minutes as Williams outlined implementation timelines and budget requirements for his proposed changes, but Maria barely heard the details. She was mentally calculating the likely impact of these modifications on pilot readiness and wondering how many young aviators would pay the price for training that prioritized Administrative convenience over tactical effectiveness. The discussion around the table focused on scheduling logistics and technical requirements, with no consideration of whether the proposed changes would actually improve pilot survival rates or mission success in real combat operations. After the meeting, Colonel Martinez approached Maria with an expression that mixed disappointment with resignation. "Captain, I need to speak with you privately about your continued tendency to question established procedures during official meetings. This kind of behavior is exactly what Colonel Richardson warned me about when you were transferred to my office." Martinez gestured toward a quiet corner of the conference room where they could speak without being overheard by the other staff members, who were gathering their materials and preparing to leave. "I understand your frustration with being assigned to administrative duties when you feel your operational experience could be better utilized in direct training roles," Martinez continued, her voice carrying the tone of someone delivering a warning that she hoped would be heeded. "However, your role here requires supporting approved programs rather than advocating for alternative approaches based on your personal combat experience. If you continue to create conflict during staff meetings, I'll have no choice but to recommend further disciplinary action." The following months at the Training Development Office became a masterclass in professional frustration as Maria watched a series of concerning patterns emerge from the intelligence reports that crossed her desk. Her administrative role required her to review after-action reports from various training exercises and compile statistical summaries for senior leadership, giving her an unwanted front-row seat to the gradual degradation of tactical readiness. Across multiple squadrons, the standardized training protocols that Williams had championed were producing pilots who performed well on written examinations and simulated computer scenarios but struggled dramatically when faced with unexpected situations during live-fire exercises. One particularly troubling report detailed a training incident at Eglin Air Force Base where an entire flight of 4 aircraft had nearly collided during a surface-to-air missile evasion exercise because none of the pilots knew how to adapt their defensive maneuvers when the simulated threat parameters changed unexpectedly. The computer-based training they had received covered standard evasion procedures but provided no instruction on modifying those procedures when facing non-standard threats. The incident had been classified as a training anomaly and attributed to equipment malfunction rather than inadequate pilot preparation. But Maria recognized the symptoms of pilots who had been trained to follow procedures rather than think tactically. Another disturbing trend appeared in the maintenance reports from deployed squadrons operating in overseas combat zones. Aircraft were returning from missions with damage patterns that suggested pilots were failing to recognize and respond appropriately to evolving threat environments. The damage was consistent with pilots who maintained predictable flight patterns, even when those patterns exposed them to unnecessary risks. Maria had seen similar patterns during her own deployments, but in those cases, the damage had typically occurred to pilots who were flying their first few combat missions and hadn't yet learned to read the tactical environment. Now, she was seeing the same vulnerability in pilots who had completed multiple deployments, but had never been taught to recognize the subtle indicators that separated safe flight paths from dangerous ones. The most alarming information came from casualty reports that Maria was required to process as part of her administrative duties. While combat losses were always tragic, the recent patterns showed an increase in incidents that could have been prevented through better tactical awareness and adaptive decision-making. Pilots were being shot down in situations where more experienced aviators would have recognized warning signs and modified their approach accordingly. The official investigation reports typically attributed these losses to equipment failures or exceptional enemy capabilities, but Maria could see that many of the incidents involved tactical errors that better training could have prevented. During one particularly frustrating afternoon, Maria received a secure message from Major Jennifer Walsh, a pilot she had mentored several years earlier, who was currently deployed to a forward operating base in the Middle East. Walsh's message was carefully worded to avoid violating operational security protocols, but her concerns were clear to anyone with tactical experience. The new pilots arriving at the deployment site were technically proficient, but lacked the situational awareness and adaptive thinking skills necessary for survival in the complex threat environment they were entering. Walsh described pilots who could execute textbook maneuvers flawlessly, but who froze when faced with situations that required improvisation or creative problem-solving. The computer training they're getting is creating pilots who think like computers. Walsh wrote in coded language that would pass security review, but conveyed her meaning to Maria. They're looking for predetermined solutions to every situation, and when they don't find an exact match in their programming, they default to the first procedure they learn rather than analyzing the tactical situation and adapting accordingly. We're having to conduct extensive remedial training here in theater just to bring them up to survival standards. Maria found herself in the impossible position of possessing information that could help address these emergent problems while being specifically prohibited from acting on that knowledge. Her administrative role gave her access to intelligence, reports and casualty data that painted a clear picture of systemic training deficiencies, but the same role prevented her from communicating these findings to anyone with the authority to implement corrective measures. The chain of command that had relegated her to administrative duties was the same chain of command that would need to acknowledge the failure of their preferred training methodologies in order to implement more effective approaches. The situation became even more complex when Lieutenant Colonel Williams announced a new initiative to expand computer-based training to include advanced tactical decision-making modules. His proposal involved developing artificial intelligence systems that could present pilots with complex scenarios and evaluate their responses according to predetermined criteria. Williams promoted this approach as the future of pilot training, promising more consistent outcomes and reduced dependence on instructor expertise that he characterized as subjective and unreliable. Maria reviewed the technical specifications for Williams's proposed AI training system and immediately recognized fundamental flaws that would actually worsen the problems she was observing in current pilot performance. The system was designed to reward responses that matched predetermined optimal solutions, but real combat situations rarely had optimal solutions that could be calculated in advance. Effective tactical decision-making required the ability to rapidly assess incomplete information, consider multiple variables that might not be quantifiable, and make decisions based on intuition and experience rather than algorithmic calculations. The AI system would essentially train pilots to think like machines, seeking computed solutions to tactical problems that required human judgment and creativity. Pilots trained on such a system would be even more vulnerable to the kind of adaptive enemies they were likely to face in actual combat, who would quickly learn to exploit the predictable responses that algorithmic training would produce. Maria realized that Williams was inadvertently designing a training system that would make American pilots easier targets for opponents who understood that humans could be more dangerous than machines when properly trained. Her attempts to communicate these concerns through official channels were met with polite dismissal and increasing impatience from supervisors, who viewed her criticism as chronic negativity rather than legitimate technical analysis. Colonel Martinez began scheduling fewer meetings that included Maria, and when she did attend staff discussions, her input was actively discouraged through subtle but clear nonverbal cues from meeting leaders. The message was unmistakable. Her expertise was not welcome. When it conflicted with approved institutional directions, the isolation became more pronounced when Maria learned that several pilots who had sought her unofficial tactical advice were being counseled by their commanders about maintaining appropriate professional relationships. Lieutenant Chun, who had previously asked thoughtful questions about tactical adaptation, began avoiding eye contact when they encountered each other. On base, Other young pilots who had once approached her with technical questions now maintained careful distance, clearly having been warned about the career risks associated with seeking guidance from someone who had been officially designated as having attitude problems. Maria found herself relying increasingly on informal intelligence networks to monitor the developing crisis in pilot readiness. Senior enlisted personnel who worked in aircraft maintenance often had insights into pilot performance that never appeared in official reports, and their observations confirmed her worst fears about the trajectory of current training programs. Master Sergeant Rodriguez, a veteran crew chief with 25 years of experience maintaining fighter aircraft, confided his concerns during a chance encounter at the base commissary. "Captain," Rodriguez said quietly while pretending to examine vegetables in the produce section, "I've been working on these birds since before you started flying, and I've never seen pilots come back from missions looking as shaken as they do. Now, they're technically competent, don't get me wrong, but they don't have that edge that separates good pilots from great ones. They follow their procedures perfectly, but when something goes wrong, they seem lost." He paused to ensure their conversation remained private. "The old-timers who trained under pilots like you, they adapt. These new kids, they look for the manual." Rodriguez's observations were consistent with reports Maria was receiving from other sources throughout the Air Force community. Instructors at various training bases were expressing similar concerns about pilot adaptability, but their feedback was being dismissed by administrative leadership, who preferred metrics that could be easily quantified and reported to higher headquarters. Training efficiency statistics showed improved graduation rates and higher test scores, creating the illusion of enhanced pilot quality while masking fundamental deficiencies in tactical thinking and situational awareness. The breaking point came during a staff meeting where Williams presented preliminary results from the pilot AI training system to a group of visiting generals who were conducting an inspection of base training operations. Williams's presentation focused on impressive statistics showing reduced training time, improved test scores, and more consistent pilot performance across various standardized scenarios. The visiting officers seemed pleased with the quantifiable improvements and praised Williams for implementing innovative training technologies that promised to revolutionize pilot education throughout the Air Force. During the question and answer session that followed Williams's presentation, General Patricia Hayes, a decorated combat veteran who served as the Air Force's Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations, asked about real-world performance indicators for pilots trained under the new system. Williams confidently cited the same test scores and training metrics he had presented earlier, but General Hayes pressed for information about actual combat effectiveness and mission success rates in operational environments. "Colonel Williams," General Hayes said with the kind of measured tone that experienced officers recognized as dangerous, "your statistics are impressive, but I'm more interested in knowing whether these training improvements are translating into better pilot performance in actual combat situations. Do we have data on mission success rates, aircraft loss ratios, or pilot survival statistics for graduates of your program?" Williams's response revealed the fundamental weakness in his approach to training evaluation. He had no meaningful data on real-world performance because his system focused entirely on training metrics rather than operational outcomes. The AI training system could measure how quickly pilots learned predetermined responses and how consistently they applied those responses in simulated scenarios, but it could not assess whether those responses would be effective in actual combat situations that didn't match the training parameters. Maria watched this exchange with growing recognition that she was witnessing a critical moment in the ongoing debate over training methodology. General Hayes clearly understood the distinction between training efficiency and tactical effectiveness, but Williams seemed unable to grasp that these were different and potentially conflicting objectives. The general's questions were exposing the hollow foundation underlying the administrative leadership's preferred approach to pilot development. When General Hayes asked whether any alternative perspectives on training effectiveness had been considered, Williams confidently assured her that his approach represented the consensus view of training experts throughout the Air Force. He made no mention of the combat veterans, who had raised concerns about tactical readiness, instead characterizing any criticism as resistance to modernization from officers who were reluctant to embrace technological advancement. Maria felt the familiar internal conflict between professional self-preservation and moral responsibility that had defined her military career. She could remain silent and allow Williams to continue his presentation unchallenged, preserving her own career while permitting the implementation of training policies that she believed would ultimately cost lives. Alternatively, she could speak up and provide General Hayes with the information she needed to make an informed assessment, knowing that such action would likely result in severe career consequences for herself. The decision to speak crystallized in Maria's mind as she watched General Hayes's expression shift from polite interest to barely concealed concern. The general was asking exactly the right questions, but Williams was providing answers that painted a dangerously incomplete picture of pilot readiness. Maria had spent her entire career believing that the military's core mission was to protect lives and accomplish objectives effectively, not to maintain comfortable administrative hierarchies at the expense of operational capability. She cleared her throat and raised her hand slightly, a gesture that caused several heads to turn in her direction, with expressions ranging from surprise to alarm. "Excuse me, General Hayes," Maria said, her voice steady despite the rapid acceleration of her heartbeat. "I have access to operational data that might help answer your question about real-world performance indicators." The conference room fell silent as every person present recognized that a significant breach of protocol was occurring. Captain-level officers did not typically interrupt presentations by lieutenant colonels to address general officers without explicit invitation, especially when those captains had documented histories of challenging institutional authority. Williams's face flushed red as he attempted to regain control of the situation through a display of administrative authority. "Captain Santos, this is neither the time nor the forum for unsolicited input from administrative personnel. Please hold your comments until the appropriate time." His tone carried the sharp edge of a commander asserting hierarchy, but General Hayes raised her hand in a gesture that clearly indicated she wanted to hear what Maria had to say. "Actually, Colonel Williams, I'm very interested in hearing from anyone who has access to operational performance data," General Hayes said, her voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to cutting through bureaucratic obstacles to reach essential information. "Captain Santos, please share your observations." The general's willingness to hear from a subordinate officer created a moment of tension that everyone in the room recognized as potentially career-defining for multiple people. Maria stood and moved to the front of the conference room, acutely aware that she was about to cross a line that would fundamentally alter her relationship with her chain of command. She had prepared for this possibility during the sleepless nights when she reviewed casualty reports and maintenance data, organizing her thoughts into a coherent presentation that could convey the urgency of the situation without revealing classified operational details. "General, my administrative duties require me to process after-action reports, casualty statistics, and maintenance records from multiple training bases and deployed units," Maria began, choosing her words carefully to avoid compromising sensitive information while still communicating the severity of the problems she had identified. "Over the past 8 months, I've observed patterns in these reports that suggest our current training methodologies may not be adequately preparing pilots for the tactical challenges they encounter in operational environments." She moved to the whiteboard at the front of the room and began sketching a simple chart that illustrated trends in pilot performance without revealing specific unit designations or classified mission details. Aircraft are returning from missions with damage patterns consistent with pilots who maintain predictable flight profiles, even when those patterns expose them to unnecessary risks. Maintenance records show increased battle damage that could have been prevented through better tactical awareness and adaptive maneuvering. Williams attempted to interrupt her presentation by raising procedural objections, but General Hayes silenced him with a look that conveyed her displeasure with his attempt to suppress potentially critical information. The other staff members in the room watched the unfolding confrontation with fascination and growing apprehension, recognizing that they were witnessing a direct challenge to established authority structures that could have far-reaching consequences for everyone present. Furthermore, Maria continued, her confidence growing as she presented information she knew to be accurate and vital. Casualty reports indicate an increase in losses that investigation teams attribute to equipment failures or exceptional enemy capabilities, but which actually involve tactical errors that better training could have prevented. Pilots are being shot down in situations where more experienced aviators would have recognized warning signs and modified their approach accordingly. Captain, Rodriguez said quietly while pretending to examine vegetables in the produce section, I've been working on these birds since before you started flying, and I've never seen pilots come back from missions looking as shaken as they do. Now, they're technically competent, don't get me wrong, but they don't have that edge that separates good pilots from great ones. They follow their procedures perfectly, but when something goes wrong, they seem lost. He paused to ensure their conversation remained private. The old-timers who trained under pilots like you, they adapt. These new kids, they look for the manual. Rodriguez's observations were consistent with reports Maria was receiving from other sources throughout the Air Force community. Instructors at various training bases were expressing similar concerns about pilot adaptability, but their feedback was being dismissed by administrative leadership, who preferred metrics that could be easily quantified and reported to higher headquarters. Training efficiency statistics showed improved graduation rates and higher test scores, creating the illusion of enhanced pilot quality while masking fundamental deficiencies in tactical thinking and situational awareness. The breaking point came during a staff meeting where Williams presented preliminary results from the pilot AI training system to a group of visiting generals who were conducting an inspection of base training operations. Williams's presentation focused on impressive statistics showing reduced training time, improved test scores, and more consistent pilot performance across various standardized scenarios. The visiting officers seemed pleased with the quantifiable improvements and praised Williams for implementing innovative training technologies that promised to revolutionize pilot education throughout the Air Force. During the question and answer session that followed Williams's presentation, General Patricia Hayes, a decorated combat veteran who served as the Air Force's Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations, asked about real-world performance indicators for pilots trained under the new system. Williams confidently cited the same test scores and training metrics he had presented earlier, but General Hayes pressed for information about actual combat effectiveness and mission success rates in operational environments. Colonel Williams, General Hayes said with the kind of measured tone that experienced officers recognized as dangerous, your statistics are impressive, but I'm more interested in knowing whether these training improvements are translating into better pilot performance in actual combat situations. Do we have data on mission success rates, aircraft loss ratios, or pilot survival statistics for graduates of your program? Williams's response revealed the fundamental weakness in his approach to training evaluation. He had no meaningful data on real-world performance because his system focused entirely on training metrics rather than operational outcomes. The AI training system could measure how quickly pilots learned predetermined responses and how consistently they applied those responses in simulated scenarios, but it could not assess whether those responses would be effective in actual combat situations that didn't match the training parameters. Maria watched this exchange with growing recognition that she was witnessing a critical moment in the ongoing debate over training methodology. General Hayes clearly understood the distinction between training efficiency and tactical effectiveness, but Williams seemed unable to grasp that these were different and potentially conflicting objectives. The general's questions were exposing the hollow foundation underlying the administrative leadership's preferred approach to pilot development. When General Hayes asked whether any alternative perspectives on training effectiveness had been considered, Williams confidently assured her that his approach represented the consensus view of training experts throughout the Air Force. He made no mention of the combat veterans, who had raised concerns about tactical readiness, instead characterizing any criticism as resistance to modernization from officers who were reluctant to embrace technological advancement. Maria felt the familiar internal conflict between professional self-preservation and moral responsibility that had defined her military career. She could remain silent and allow Williams to continue his presentation unchallenged, preserving her own career while permitting the implementation of training policies that she believed would ultimately cost lives. Alternatively, she could speak up and provide General Hayes with the information she needed to make an informed assessment, knowing that such action would likely result in severe career consequences for herself. The decision to speak crystallized in Maria's mind as she watched General Hayes's expression shift from polite interest to barely concealed concern. The general was asking exactly the right questions, but Williams was providing answers that painted a dangerously incomplete picture of pilot readiness. Maria had spent her entire career believing that the military's core mission was to protect lives and accomplish objectives effectively, not to maintain comfortable administrative hierarchies at the expense of operational capability. She cleared her throat and raised her hand slightly, a gesture that caused several heads to turn in her direction, with expressions ranging from surprise to alarm. "Excuse me, General Hayes," Maria said, her voice steady despite the rapid acceleration of her heartbeat. "I have access to operational data that might help answer your question about real-world performance indicators." The conference room fell silent as every person present recognized that a significant breach of protocol was occurring. Captain-level officers did not typically interrupt presentations by lieutenant colonels to address general officers without explicit invitation, especially when those captains had documented histories of challenging institutional authority. Williams's face flushed red as he attempted to regain control of the situation through a display of administrative authority. "Captain Santos, this is neither the time nor the forum for unsolicited input from administrative personnel. Please hold your comments until the appropriate time." His tone carried the sharp edge of a commander asserting hierarchy, but General Hayes raised her hand in a gesture that clearly indicated she wanted to hear what Maria had to say. "Actually, Colonel Williams, I'm very interested in hearing from anyone who has access to operational performance data," General Hayes said, her voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to cutting through bureaucratic obstacles to reach essential information. "Captain Santos, please share your observations." The general's willingness to hear from a subordinate officer created a moment of tension that everyone in the room recognized as potentially career-defining for multiple people. Maria stood and moved to the front of the conference room, acutely aware that she was about to cross a line that would fundamentally alter her relationship with her chain of command. She had prepared for this possibility during the sleepless nights when she reviewed casualty reports and maintenance data, organizing her thoughts into a coherent presentation that could convey the urgency of the situation without revealing classified operational details. "General, my administrative duties require me to process after-action reports, casualty statistics, and maintenance records from multiple training bases and deployed units," Maria began, choosing her words carefully to avoid compromising sensitive information while still communicating the severity of the problems she had identified. Over the past 8 months, I've observed patterns in these reports that suggest our current training methodologies may not be adequately preparing pilots for the tactical challenges they encounter in operational environments. She moved the whiteboard at the front of the room and began sketching a simple chart that illustrated trends in pilot performance without revealing specific unit designations or classified mission details. Aircraft are returning from missions with damage patterns consistent with pilots who maintain predictable flight profiles, even when those patterns expose them to unnecessary risks. Maintenance records show increased battle damage that could have been prevented through better tactical awareness and adaptive maneuvering. Williams attempted to interrupt her presentation by raising procedural objections, but General Hayes silenced him with a look that conveyed her displeasure with his attempt to suppress potentially critical information. The other staff members in the room watched the unfolding confrontation with fascination and growing apprehension, recognizing that they were witnessing a direct challenge to established authority structures that could have far-reaching consequences for everyone present. Furthermore, Maria continued, her confidence growing as she presented information she knew to be accurate and vital. Casualty reports indicate an increase in losses that investigation teams attribute to equipment failures or exceptional enemy capabilities, but which actually involve tactical errors that better training could have prevented. Pilots are being shot down in situations where more experienced aviators would have recognized warning signs and modified their approach accordingly. She turned back to face the assembled officers, making eye contact with General Hayes while carefully avoiding looking directly at Williams, whose expression had progressed from anger to something approaching panic. The computer-based training systems that Colonel Williams has implemented are producing pilots who can execute predetermined procedures flawlessly, but who lack the adaptive thinking skills necessary for survival when those procedures prove inadequate for specific tactical situations. General Hayes leaned forward in her chair, her expression indicating intense interest in Maria's analysis. Captain, can you be more specific about the nature of these tactical deficiencies? What exactly are these pilots failing to do that their predecessors would have done automatically? The general's question demonstrated a level of tactical understanding that suggested she recognized the implications of Maria's observations. Maria felt a surge of relief at being asked a question that allowed her to focus on specific technical issues rather than general criticisms of institutional policies. Ma'am, the primary deficiency appears to be an inability to recognize and respond to environmental indicators that don't match their training scenarios. For example, pilots are failing to detect changes in enemy radar patterns that would signal increased threat levels, or they're not recognizing terrain features that could provide tactical advantages during evasive maneuvers. She moved back to the whiteboard and sketched a simple tactical scenario that illustrated her point without revealing classified information. Computer-based training teaches pilots to respond to specific threat indicators with predetermined countermeasures, but real combat situations often involve combinations of threats or environmental factors that don't match the training parameters. Exactly. Pilots trained primarily on computer simulations tend to look for exact matches to their programmed responses, rather than analyzing the tactical situation and adapting their approach accordingly. Williams finally found an opening to reassert his authority and challenge Maria's analysis through an appeal to institutional credibility rather than technical accuracy. General Hayes, with all due respect to Captain Santos's individual perspective, her analysis contradicts extensive research conducted by training experts throughout the Air Force. The computer-based systems we've implemented have been thoroughly tested and validated through rigorous scientific methodology. General Hayes turned to Williams with an expression that suggested she was less impressed by appeals to authority than by practical results. Colonel, I'm less interested in the credentials of your training experts than I am in knowing whether Their methods are producing pilots who can survive and accomplish missions in actual combat environments. Captain Santos appears to have access to operational data that directly addresses this question. The general's response created an uncomfortable moment of silence as Williams realized that his preferred approach to defending institutional decisions was not resonating with a senior officer who prioritized operational effectiveness over administrative convenience. The other staff members in the room began shifting nervously in their chairs, recognizing that they were witnessing a fundamental clash between different approaches to military leadership and decision-making. Maria seized the opportunity to provide additional context that might help General Hayes understand the scope of the problems she had identified. "Ma'am, I've also received informal reports from deployed squadron commanders indicating that new pilots require extensive remedial training in theater, just to bring them up to survival standards. The technical proficiency these pilots demonstrate in training environments doesn't translate effectively to the complex, rapidly changing conditions they encounter in actual combat zones." She paused to ensure that her next statement would have maximum impact on the assembled officers. Several experienced pilots have described the newer graduates as thinking like computers rather than tactical aviators. They look for algorithmic solutions to problems that require human judgment and creativity, making them predictable and vulnerable to adaptive enemies who can exploit their programmed responses. General Hayes nodded slowly, her expression indicating that Maria's observations aligned with her own concerns about current training trends. "Captain, in your assessment, what would be required to address these deficiencies while maintaining the efficiency gains that Colonel Williams has achieved through standardization?" The general's question suggested that she was looking for practical solutions rather than simply criticism of existing policies. Maria had anticipated this question and had spent considerable time developing recommendations that could improve tactical readiness without completely abandoning the administrative benefits of standardized training. "Ma'am, I believe we need to integrate traditional instructor-led tactical decision-making exercises with the computer-based systems. The AI training can handle basic procedural instruction efficiently, but complex tactical scenarios require human instructors who can introduce unexpected variables and teach adaptive thinking skills." Williams immediately objected to Maria's recommendation, arguing that instructor-led training was inherently inconsistent and difficult to standardize across multiple installations. "General, what Captain Santos is proposing would essentially reverse the standardization gains we've achieved and return to the subjective training methods that produced inconsistent outcomes." His response revealed his fundamental misunderstanding of the distinction between consistency and effectiveness in training objectives. General Hayes studied both officers for a moment before responding, her expression suggesting that she was evaluating not just their technical arguments, but also their underlying approaches to military leadership and responsibility. "Colonel Williams, I appreciate your commitment to training efficiency, but efficiency that doesn't translate into operational effectiveness is merely an expensive way to produce inadequate results." The general stood and walked to the front of the room, positioning herself where she could address both Williams and Maria directly. "Captain Santos, your analysis raises serious concerns that require immediate investigation. I want you to prepare a detailed briefing on pilot performance trends for my staff within the next 48 hours. Include specific recommendations for addressing the deficiencies you've identified." Williams's expression shifted from anger to something approaching desperation as he realized that his preferred training methodologies were being challenged by someone with the authority to implement significant changes. "General, I must protest the elevation of Captain Santos's individual opinions over the collective expertise of our training development teams. Her reputation for challenging established procedures is well documented, and her analysis may be influenced by personal grievances rather than objective assessment." The general's response to Williams's attempt to discredit Maria's analysis revealed both her leadership philosophy and her assessment of the relative credibility of the two officers. "Colonel, I'm less concerned with Captain Santos's reputation than I am with the accuracy of her observations. If her analysis is incorrect, then your performance data should easily refute her claims. If her analysis is accurate, then we have serious problems that require immediate attention, regardless of who identified them." General Hayes turned back to Maria with an expression that conveyed both authority and respect for competence. "Captain, I'm also directing you to prepare recommendations for pilot training reforms that address the tactical deficiencies you've identified. I want practical solutions that can be implemented quickly without completely disrupting existing training schedules." The general's directive represented a dramatic reversal of Maria's professional circumstances, transforming her from an administrative outcast to a key advisor on critical training policy. The meeting concluded with General Hayes announcing that she would be conducting a comprehensive review of pilot training effectiveness across all Air Force installations, using Maria's analysis as a starting point for identifying systemic problems that required correction. Williams was directed to provide complete access to training records and performance data, while Maria was temporarily reassigned to work directly with the general staff on developing improved training protocols. As the assembled officers filed out of the conference room, Maria found herself surrounded by a mixture of congratulations and barely concealed hostility from colleagues, who recognized that the balance of power had shifted dramatically. Some officers approached her with expressions of relief, suggesting that they had shared her concerns, but lacked the courage or platform to voice them publicly. Others maintained careful distance, clearly uncertain about the political implications of being associated with someone who had just challenged established institutional policies so directly. Colonel Martinez approached Maria with an expression that mixed professional respect with personal concern about the potential consequences of the day's events. "Captain, what you did in there took considerable courage, but you've also made some powerful enemies who won't forget this challenge to their authority. Be very careful about how you proceed from here." Martinez's warning reflected the complex dynamics of military organizations where competence and political acumen were not always aligned. The emergency alert shattered the pre-dawn silence at Nellis Air Force Base at 0347 hours on a Tuesday morning in late October. Maria jolted awake in her quarters to the distinctive wail of the base alarm system, followed immediately by the authoritative voice of the command center announcing over the public address system, all personnel, this is not a drill. Report to emergency stations immediately. Condition red is now in effect." The urgency in the announcer's voice carried a weight that distinguished this alert from the routine exercises that occasionally interrupted base operations. Maria dressed quickly in her flight suit, muscle memory guiding her through the familiar routine she had performed countless times during her combat deployments. The emergency lighting in the hallways cast everything in an eerie red glow as personnel hurried toward their assigned stations, their faces reflecting the same mixture of alertness and apprehension that accompanied genuine crises. The base had transformed from its usual peacetime atmosphere into the focused intensity of a military installation preparing for immediate action. The command center was a scene of controlled chaos when Maria arrived, with dozens of personnel manning communication stations, monitoring radar displays, and coordinating responses to what was clearly a developing situation of significant magnitude. Large screens displayed tactical information that painted a disturbing picture. An unidentified aircraft had penetrated restricted airspace near a classified research facility approximately 200 miles north of the base, and initial attempts to establish communication with the intruder had failed completely. General Hayes stood at the center of the operations floor, still wearing the same uniform from the previous day's meetings, suggesting that she had been working through the night on the pilot training review when this crisis erupted. Her expression reflected the focused intensity of a senior officer, managing a potentially dangerous situation with incomplete information and limited response options. The general's presence at the base during this emergency was fortuitous, providing immediate senior leadership that might otherwise have required precious time to coordinate through distant headquarters. "What's our current situation?" General Hayes asked Colonel Davidson, the base operations commander, as Maria approached the tactical display area where senior officers were coordinating the response effort. Davidson was a seasoned officer with extensive experience in air defense operations, but his expression suggested that this particular situation presented unusual challenges that didn't fit standard response protocols. "Ma'am, at 0330 hours, an unidentified aircraft appeared on radar approximately 50 miles northeast of the Groom Lake facility, flying at low altitude and maintaining radio silence despite repeated attempts to establish contact," Davidson reported, pointing to the radar track displayed on the main tactical screen. "The aircraft appears to be a modified civilian jet, but its flight profile and electronic signature don't match any known aircraft types in our database." The significance of an unidentified aircraft near Groom Lake, one of the military's most sensitive research installations, was immediately apparent to everyone in the command center. The facility housed classified aerospace research programs that represented some of the nation's most advanced technological capabilities, making any unauthorized intrusion a potential national security crisis requiring immediate and decisive response. "What interceptor assets do we have available for immediate deployment?" General Hayes asked, her tone indicating that she was already moving beyond information gathering toward action planning. The tactical situation required rapid response with aircraft capable of intercepting and evaluating the unknown target while maintaining the flexibility to escalate or de-escalate as circumstances demanded. Colonel Davidson consulted his status board and delivered information that created immediate concern among the assembled officers. "Ma'am, we have 4 F-22 Raptors on alert status, but they're all configured for air superiority missions with full afterburner capability. The challenge is that the unknown aircraft is flying extremely low altitude patterns through mountainous terrain that makes standard intercept approaches very difficult." Maria studied the tactical display and immediately recognized the complexity of the situation facing the base's response team. The unidentified aircraft was following flight paths through canyon systems and mountain valleys that would make it nearly invisible to most radar systems and extremely difficult for high-speed interceptors to track effectively. The terrain masking and low-altitude flight profile suggested either a pilot with intimate knowledge of the local geography or sophisticated navigation equipment designed to exploit natural radar shadows. The F-22s are designed for high-altitude intercepts against conventional aircraft, Maria observed quietly to Lieutenant Colonel Harris, the operations officer standing nearby. Their speed and altitude capabilities actually work against them in this type of low-level pursuit scenario. They'll have difficulty maintaining visual contact with the target that's maneuvering through terrain features at treetop level. Harris nodded grimly, recognizing the tactical challenge that Maria had identified. "That's exactly what our pilots are reporting. They can acquire the target briefly when it crosses open areas, but they lose contact whenever it enters the canyon systems. By the time they complete a wide turn to reacquire, the target has changed course and disappeared into a different valley." General Hayes overheard this exchange and immediately grasped at the implications of the tactical mismatch between available assets and mission requirements. The situation required an interceptor capable of low-altitude, low-speed maneuvering through challenging terrain while maintaining the capability to engage an uncooperative target if necessary. The F-22s were extraordinary aircraft, but they were optimized for entirely different mission parameters than those presented by the current crisis. What other aircraft do we have available that might be better suited for this type of pursuit? General Hayes asked, her question directed toward the assembled operations staff. The urgency in her voice reflected the time pressure created by an unidentified aircraft that continued to maneuver near sensitive installations while evading attempts at interception or identification. Colonel Davidson reviewed his aircraft status displays and shook his head in frustration. Ma'am, most of our available assets are configured for high-altitude missions or air-to-ground operations that aren't appropriate for this type of intercept scenario. We have some training aircraft available, but they lack the speed and armament necessary for dealing with a potentially hostile intruder. Maria felt the familiar surge of recognition that accompanied moments when her specialized expertise became relevant to critical situations. The tactical scenario developing around the unidentified aircraft required exactly the kind of low-altitude, terrain-following capabilities that she had mastered during her combat deployments, and that were built into the aircraft she knew better than any other pilot on the base. General, Maria said, stepping forward with the confidence of someone who understood both the tactical requirements and the available solutions. The A-10 in Hangar 7 is configured for exactly this type of mission. It's designed for low-altitude operations in challenging terrain, has extended loitering capability, and carries sufficient armament to engage ground or air targets if necessary. The suggestion created a moment of stunned silence among the assembled officers, most of whom had never considered the venerable A-10 as an air-to-air interceptor, despite its proven capabilities in unconventional scenarios. The aircraft was primarily known for close air support missions and ground attack operations, but its design characteristics made it uniquely suited for the current tactical challenge. General Hayes studied Maria with an expression that suggested rapid mental calculation of options and probabilities. Captain Santos, are you qualified to conduct intercept operations in mountainous terrain at low altitude? The general's question carried implications that extended far beyond simple aircraft qualifications, touching on the tactical judgment and situational awareness required for potentially dangerous missions. Yes, ma'am, Maria replied without hesitation. I've conducted similar operations during deployments in Afghanistan, where we tracked and intercepted low-flying aircraft attempting to evade radar detection through mountain valleys. The A-10's slow speed and maneuverability advantages actually make it superior to faster aircraft for this type of mission. Colonel Davidson immediately raised procedural objections that reflected institutional preferences for conventional approaches to tactical challenges. General, using an A-10 for air intercept operations is highly irregular. The aircraft lacks the speed and sophisticated radar systems that standard interceptors provide. We'd be sending Captain Santos into a potentially dangerous situation with inadequate equipment. Maria recognized Davidson's concerns as legitimate from a conventional perspective, but she also understood that conventional approaches were failing to address the current tactical reality. Sir, the A-10's limitations in speed and radar capability are offset by its advantages in low-altitude maneuverability and pilot visibility. In mountainous terrain against a low-flying target, those advantages may be more important than raw speed. General Hayes weighed the competing arguments while monitoring the tactical display, which showed the unidentified aircraft continuing to evade the F-22 interceptors through terrain, masking an unpredictable course changes. Time was becoming a critical factor as the unknown intruder continued operating near sensitive installations while conventional response measures proved ineffective. How quickly can you have the A-10 airborne and en route to the target area? General Hayes asked Maria, her question indicating that she was seriously considering the unconventional intercept option, despite the procedural irregularities it represented. Maria calculated pre-flight requirements and transit time to the target area, drawing on her extensive experience with rapid deployment scenarios. Ma'am, I can be airborne in 15 minutes and on station in the target area within 30 minutes of launch authorization. The A-10's fuel capacity and efficiency will allow extended operations in the search area without requiring tanker support. The general turned to Colonel Davidson with an expression that clearly indicated her decision-making process had reached a conclusion. Colonel, authorize Captain Santos for immediate departure. Provide her with all available intelligence on the target aircraft and maintain continuous communication throughout the intercept mission. Her directive represented a dramatic departure from standard protocols, but it also reflected a senior leader's willingness to employ available resources creatively when conventional approaches proved inadequate. Davidson's expression reflected his discomfort with authorizing such an unconventional mission, but his response demonstrated the military discipline that prioritized mission accomplishment over personal preferences. Yes, ma'am. Captain Santos, report to Hangar 7 immediately for aircraft preparation. Intelligence will brief you on target characteristics and last known position during your pre-flight procedures. As Maria hurried toward the hangar, she could hear Davidson coordinating communication frequencies and backup assets in case the A-10 intercept mission encountered difficulties. The base's operations staff were adapting existing procedures to accommodate an aircraft and mission profile that didn't fit standard intercept protocols, demonstrating the kind of tactical flexibility that effective military organizations required. When facing unexpected challenges, the A-10 sat in Hangar 7 exactly as Maria had left it after her last training flight, its familiar bulk and distinctive configuration providing reassurance that she would soon be operating equipment she understood completely. The ground crew had already begun pre-flight preparations based on Davidson's instructions, checking fuel levels, armament status, and communication systems with the efficiency of personnel accustomed to rapid deployment requirements. Master Sergeant Rodriguez approached as Maria began her external inspection of the aircraft, his expression mixing professional concern with personal respect for her tactical capabilities. Captain, I've loaded standard air-to-air missiles along with the cannon ammunition, but I have to ask whether you're really planning to intercept an unknown aircraft in that mountain terrain using A-10. Maria smiled at Rodriguez's question, recognizing the mixture of skepticism and curiosity that her mission assignment had generated among the ground crew. Sergeant, sometimes the right tool for the job isn't the most obvious choice. The A-10 may not be fast, but it can go places and do things that faster aircraft can't manage. As she completed her pre-flight inspection and prepared to launch into what could potentially be a dangerous intercept mission, Maria reflected on the irony that her expertise was once again being called upon to solve problems that conventional approaches couldn't address. The same aircraft that had been mocked as obsolete was about to attempt a mission that the Air Force's most advanced interceptors had been unable to accomplish. The A-10's engines spooled to life with their characteristic low rumble as Maria completed her final systems checks and received clearance for immediate takeoff. The familiar vibration of the aircraft resonated through her body like a greeting from an old friend, providing a sense of confidence that came from thousands of hours spent mastering this particular machine's capabilities and limitations. Dawn was beginning to break over the Nevada mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that would normally have been beautiful, but now serve as a backdrop for what could potentially be a dangerous confrontation with an unknown adversary. Control Tower, this is Warthog 1 requesting immediate departure clearance for intercept mission. Maria transmitted as she taxied toward the active runway, using the unofficial call sign that A-10 pilots had adopted with pride, despite its less than flattering origins. The control tower's response was immediate and professional, clearing her for takeoff with priority handling that reflected the urgency of her mission and the unusual circumstances that had led to an A-10 being tasked with air intercept duties. As Maria lifted off into the morning sky, She could see the 4 F-22 Raptors circling at high altitude in the distance, their sleek silhouettes barely visible against the brightening horizon. Radio chatter from the intercept controllers indicated that the advanced fighters were continuing to struggle with maintaining contact with their low-flying target, repeatedly acquiring and losing radar lock as the unidentified aircraft exploited terrain masking and unpredictable flight patterns to avoid detection and interception. Warthog 1, this is Control. Be advised, target aircraft is currently tracking northeast through Devil's Canyon at approximately 500 feet above ground level, maintaining radio silence and showing no response to warning signals, the controller reported, providing Maria with the tactical information she needed to plan her intercept approach. F-22 elements report difficulty maintaining visual contact due to terrain interference and target's erratic maneuvering patterns. Maria acknowledged the transmission while adjusting her flight path toward the last known position of the unidentified aircraft, drawing on her extensive experience with low-altitude navigation in mountainous terrain to plan an approach that would maximize her chances of locating and maintaining contact with the elusive target. Unlike the high-speed interceptors that had to maintain considerable altitude to avoid terrain conflicts, the A-10's slower speed and enhanced maneuverability allowed her to descend into the canyon systems where the target aircraft was operating. Nevada landscape unfolded beneath her as she approached the target area, revealing the complex network of canyons, ridges, and valleys that made this region ideal for avoiding radar detection and conventional intercept procedures. Maria's tactical thinking shifted into the analytical mode she had developed during combat deployments, mentally cataloging terrain features that could provide concealment for aircraft, attempting to evade detection while identifying potential flight corridors that a knowledgeable pilot might use to navigate through the challenging topography. Control, Warthog 1 entering target area and beginning systematic search pattern, Maria reported as she descended to 800 feet above ground level and began following the canyon system where the unknown aircraft had last been detected. Her approach differed fundamentally from the high-altitude search patterns that the F-22s had employed, instead utilizing the A-10's unique capabilities to conduct a methodical low-level search that could detect aircraft hidden in terrain shadows, invisible to higher-flying interceptors. The first 20 minutes of searching proved frustrating as Maria methodically explored canyon after canyon without finding any trace of the elusive target aircraft. The terrain was even more challenging than intelligence reports had suggested, with numerous side canyons and hidden valleys that could easily conceal a small aircraft from casual observation. The unidentified intruder clearly possessed either intimate knowledge of the local geography or sophisticated navigation equipment that allowed precise maneuvering through terrain that would challenge even experienced pilots. Maria's persistence and methodical search pattern finally paid off when she spotted a brief reflection of sunlight off metal surfaces in a narrow canyon approximately 15 miles northwest of the initial detection area. The flash lasted only a few seconds before disappearing behind a rock formation, but it was enough to confirm that she had located her target and that the aircraft was indeed maneuvering at extremely low altitude through terrain that would make conventional intercept approaches nearly impossible. Control, Warthog 1 has visual contact with target aircraft in Serpent Canyon, approximately 15 miles northwest of initial detection point, Maria transmitted, her voice carrying the calm professionalism of a pilot who had found her quarry after a challenging search. Target appears to be a modified business jet conducting systematic reconnaissance of the area using terrain masking to avoid detection. The radio response from the command center reflected both relief at finally locating the intruder and concern about the tactical implications of an aircraft conducting apparent surveillance operations near sensitive military installations. Warthog 1, maintain visual contact and attempt to establish communication with target aircraft. You are authorized to use warning signals if target continues to ignore radio calls. Maria maneuvered the A-10 into a position where she could maintain observation of the target aircraft while remaining far enough away to avoid creating a collision hazard in the confined canyon environment. As she drew closer, details of the intruding aircraft became visible that confirmed her initial assessment and raised additional questions about the nature of this incursion into restricted airspace. The aircraft was indeed a modified business jet, but modifications that were clearly visible from her observation position suggested capabilities far beyond those of a standard civilian aircraft. Additional antennas and sensor equipment were mounted on the fuselage and wings, indicating sophisticated electronic surveillance capabilities that could potentially compromise classified research activities at nearby installations. The professional quality of the modifications and the pilot's demonstrated skill in low-altitude terrain navigation suggested this was not a casual airspace violation, but a deliberate intelligence-gathering operation. Unidentified aircraft in Serpent Canyon. This is United States Air Force interceptor on your 6 o'clock position. Maria transmitted on the emergency frequency, following established procedures for attempting to establish communication with uncooperative aircraft in restricted airspace. You are in violation of restricted military airspace and are directed to immediately establish radio contact and comply with instructions for departure from this area. The target aircraft's response was immediate and alarming. Instead of acknowledging her transmission or beginning departure procedures, the pilot initiated a series of aggressive evasive maneuvers that demonstrated both advanced flying skills and clear intent to avoid interception. The business jet dove deeper into the canyon system and began following an extremely complex flight path that utilized every available terrain feature to maintain concealment while continuing its apparent surveillance mission. Maria found herself in exactly the type of tactical situation that her experience and aircraft capabilities were uniquely suited to handle. The A-10's slower speed allowed her to match the target's maneuvering without overshooting, while her combat experience provided the situational awareness necessary to anticipate the other pilot's tactical decisions and maintain contact despite the challenging terrain environment. Control. Target aircraft is actively evading interception and continuing reconnaissance activities in restricted airspace. Maria reported while maneuvering to maintain visual contact with the increasingly evasive intruder. Pilot demonstrates advanced skills and intimate knowledge of local terrain features. This appears to be a professional intelligence gathering operation rather than accidental airspace violation. The command center's response reflected the escalating seriousness of the situation as it became clear that the base was dealing with a deliberate espionage attempt rather than a navigation error or equipment malfunction. Warthog 1, you are authorized to use all necessary measures to force compliance with departure instructions. Warning shots are authorized if target continues to evade and refuses communication. Maria felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that accompanied the transition from routine intercept procedures to potentially hostile engagement, but her extensive combat experience allowed her to maintain the calm focus necessary for effective tactical decision-making. She maneuvered the A-10 into a position where she could deliver warning shots that would be clearly visible to the target pilot, without creating unacceptable risks of collateral damage in the confined canyon environment. The 30mm cannon mounted in the A-10's nose spoke with its distinctive roar as Maria fired a brief burst ahead of the target aircraft's flight path, creating unmistakable tracer patterns that clearly communicated the seriousness of her instructions. The warning shots had their intended effect. The business jet's pilot immediately reduced speed and began climbing out of the canyon system, finally acknowledging that continued evasion was no longer a viable option. United States Air Force interceptor. This is November 7-4 Alpha, came the delayed radio response from the target aircraft, the pilot's voice carrying a slight accent that suggested foreign origin. We are experiencing navigation equipment malfunction, and we're attempting to establish our position using visual landmarks. We did not realize we had entered restricted airspace. Maria recognized the response as a carefully crafted cover story, designed to provide plausible deniability for what had clearly been a deliberate intelligence-gathering operation. But she also understood that her mission was to ensure departure from restricted airspace rather than to prove criminal intent. November 7 for Alpha. You are directed to immediately depart restricted airspace and proceed to Las Vegas, McCarran International Airport for inspection by federal authorities. The remainder of the intercept mission proceeded according to standard procedures as Maria escorted the intruding aircraft out of restricted airspace and handed control to civilian authorities who would conduct detailed investigation of the aircraft's equipment and mission. The professional manner in which the target pilot complied with departure instructions confirmed Maria's assessment that this had been a sophisticated intelligence operation conducted by experienced personnel rather than an accidental incursion. As she turned back toward Nellis Air Force Base, Maria reflected on the tactical lessons that the morning's mission had provided about the continuing relevance of aircraft and pilots who could operate effectively in challenging environments that defeated more advanced systems. The F-22 Raptors had been unable to maintain contact with the target despite their superior speed and sophisticated radar systems, while the allegedly obsolete O-10 had successfully located, intercepted, and forced compliance from an evasive intruder operating in extremely difficult terrain. Control, Warthog 1 mission complete. Target aircraft departed restricted airspace and handed off to civilian authorities, Maria transmitted as she approached the base for landing. Returning to base for debrief and mission analysis. The professional satisfaction in her voice reflected not just successful mission completion, but also vindication of tactical approaches that had been dismissed by advocates of purely technological solutions to complex operational challenges. The landing and taxi back to the flight line provided Maria with time to organize her thoughts about the morning's events and their implications for ongoing debates about pilot training and aircraft capabilities. She had once again demonstrated that experience, adaptability, and intimate knowledge of aircraft capabilities could accomplish missions that sophisticated technology alone could not handle, providing practical proof of arguments she had been making through official and unofficial channels for months. The debriefing room at Nellis Air Force Base buzzed with an energy that Maria had rarely experienced during her administrative assignment. General Hayes sat at the head of the conference table, flanked by intelligence officers, operations specialists, and senior staff members who had monitored every aspect of the morning's intercept mission through real-time communications and radar tracking. The large screens around the room displayed tactical maps showing the flight paths of both the intruding aircraft and Maria's successful pursuit, creating a visual record of events that would undoubtedly be analyzed extensively in the coming days. Captain Santos, General Hayes began, her tone carrying the mixture of professional appreciation and genuine curiosity about the tactical decisions that had led to mission success. Your intercept of the unidentified aircraft accomplished what 4 F-22 Raptors could not achieve despite their technological advantages. I want you to walk us through your tactical approach and explain how you were able to maintain contact with a target that had successfully evaded our most advanced interceptors. Maria stood and moved to the tactical display, pointing to the canyon systems where she had conducted her systematic search for the elusive target aircraft. Ma'am, the key difference was matching aircraft capabilities to mission requirements, rather than assuming that more advanced technology would automatically produce better results. The F-22's speed and altitude advantages actually worked against them in this specific tactical environment. She traced the flight path she had followed during her search, highlighting the methodical approach that had eventually led to target acquisition. The A-10's slower speed allowed me to conduct a thorough low-altitude search of terrain features, where the target could conceivably hide, while the F-22s were limited to high altitude. Search patterns that couldn't penetrate the radar shadows created by canyon walls and rock formations. Colonel Davidson, who had initially expressed reservations about using an A-10 for intercept operations, leaned forward with obvious interest in understanding how unconventional tactics had succeeded where standard procedures had failed. Captain, when you spotted the target aircraft, how were you able to maintain visual contact despite its evasive maneuvering? Our pilots reported losing the target every time it entered terrain masking. Maria smiled slightly, recognizing that Davidson's question provided an opportunity to explain tactical principles that extended far beyond this specific mission. Sir, maintaining contact required anticipating the target pilot's tactical decisions, rather than simply reacting to observed movements. Combat experience in similar terrain taught me to think like the pilot I was pursuing, considering what options would be available from each position and positioning myself to maintain observation regardless of which escape route the target chose. She moved to another section of the tactical display and sketched the evasive maneuvers that the target aircraft had employed during the latter stages of the intercept. The target pilot was highly skilled and demonstrated intimate knowledge of local terrain features, but every evasive maneuver revealed information about their tactical thinking and operational objectives. By analyzing their choices, I could predict likely future actions and position myself accordingly. Intelligence Officer Major Patricia Reynolds raised questions about the target, aircraft's equipment and capabilities that had become apparent during the close-range observation Maria had been able to conduct. Captain, your report mentioned sophisticated electronic surveillance equipment visible on the aircraft's exterior. Can you provide more details about what you observed and how that information might relate to the aircraft's probable mission? Maria consulted her handwritten notes from the mission debrief, recognizing the importance of providing accurate intelligence about potential foreign espionage operations in sensitive military areas. Ma'am, the aircraft carried multiple antennae arrays and sensor packages that appeared professionally installed and integrated with the aircraft systems. The modifications were consistent with signals intelligence collection rather than simple navigation or communication equipment. She paused to ensure that her next observation would receive appropriate attention from the intelligence specialists present. The pilot's flight pattern suggested systematic surveillance of specific ground installations rather than random reconnaissance. The aircraft followed routes that would provide optimal observation angles for key facilities while maximizing concealment from radar detection systems. General Hayes exchanged glances with the intelligence officers, her expression indicating that Maria's observations confirmed suspicions about the nature and objectives of the morning's intrusion. Captain, in your assessment, what would have happened if the F-22s had continued attempting intercept operations without your successful intervention? The question touched on tactical implications that extended beyond the immediate mission, addressing fundamental issues about the effectiveness of different approaches to complex operational challenges. Maria considered her response carefully, recognizing that her analysis would likely influence future doctrine and training decisions. Ma'am, the target aircraft would probably have completed its surveillance mission and departed undetected. Maria replied with the directness that had characterized her military career. The F-22 pilots were using standard intercept procedures that work effectively against conventional threats, but this situation required adaptive tactics that couldn't be found in approved playbooks. She gestured toward the flight path data displayed on the tactical screens around the room. More importantly, the target pilot was learning from each failed intercept attempt, gathering information about our radar coverage patterns and response procedures that could be used to plan future intrusions. Every unsuccessful pursuit provided intelligence about our defensive capabilities and limitations. Lieutenant Colonel Williams, who had remained silent throughout most of the debriefing session, finally spoke up with a question that revealed his continued commitment to standardized training approaches, despite the morning's clear demonstration of their limitations. Captain Santos, while your mission was successful, it required tactical improvisation that would be difficult to teach through standardized training curricula. How do you propose we incorporate such individualized approaches into systematic pilot education programs? Maria recognized Williams's question as both a legitimate tactical inquiry and a subtle attempt to minimize the broader implications of her successful mission for ongoing debates about training methodology. Her response would need to address the technical aspects of tactical instruction while also highlighting the fundamental differences between algorithmic approaches and adaptive thinking. Sir, the tactical principles I employed this morning aren't improvisation. They're fundamental skills that were once considered basic pilot qualifications, Maria replied, her tone remaining respectful while clearly challenging Williams's characterization of her approach. Reading terrain, anticipating enemy actions, and adapting to unexpected situations used to be core components of pilot training before we decided that computer simulations could replace actual tactical thinking. She moved back to the tactical display and highlighted specific decision points during the intercept mission where traditional training principles had proven essential for mission success. These skills can absolutely be taught through systematic instruction, but they require human instructors who can present unpredictable scenarios and teach students to think tactically rather than algorithmically. General Hayes leaned back in her chair, her expression suggesting that she was synthesizing information from multiple sources to reach conclusions about broader policy implications. Captain Santos, based on your analysis of pilot training deficiencies and your demonstrated tactical capabilities, I'm assigning you to lead a complete review of our intercept training programs. I want recommendations for incorporating adaptive tactical training that addresses the kind of real-world challenges you handled successfully this morning. The assignment represented a dramatic reversal of Maria's professional circumstances, transforming her from an administrative outcast to a key player in developing improved training doctrine for the entire Air Force. Williams's expression reflected his recognition that his preferred training methodologies were being fundamentally challenged by someone who had just provided practical proof of their limitations. Furthermore, General Hayes continued, I'm recommending you for immediate promotion to Major and assignment as Deputy Director of Tactical Training Development. Your combat experience and demonstrated ability to succeed where conventional approaches fail make you uniquely qualified to address the training deficiencies we've identified. Colonel Martinez, who had been quietly observing the proceedings from the back of the room, approached Maria after the formal debriefing concluded. Her expression mixed professional congratulations with personal relief that her warning about potential career consequences had proven unnecessary. Maria, Martinez said quietly, using her first name for the first time since they had worked together, what you accomplished this morning goes far beyond successful mission completion. You've demonstrated that expertise and tactical thinking are still relevant in an era when many people believe technology can replace human judgment. The comment reflected broader recognition among the assembled officers at the morning's events, had implications extending well beyond a single intercept mission. Maria's success had provided practical validation of arguments about the continuing importance of tactical thinking, adaptive training, and pilot skills that couldn't be reduced to computer algorithms. Master Sergeant Rodriguez appeared in the pilot skills that couldn't be reduced to computer algorithms. Debriefing room doorway, still wearing the maintenance coveralls he had donned during the pre-dawn aircraft preparation. His presence reminded Maria of the ground personnel whose professional dedication made successful missions possible, regardless of the tactical approaches employed by the pilots they supported. Major Santos, Rodriguez said, with a grin that reflected both personal pride and professional satisfaction. That was some fine flying this morning. Words already spreading through the maintenance community about how the old Warthog accomplished what the fancy jets couldn't handle. Rodriguez's comment highlighted an important aspect of the morning's success that extended beyond tactical effectiveness to morale and institutional culture. The attend's success had vindicated not just Maria's approach to pilot training but also the value of aircraft and personnel that were often dismissed as obsolete by advocates of modernization. Through technology alone. As the debriefing session concluded and personnel began filing out of the conference room, Maria found herself surrounded by pilots and staff officers who wanted to understand more about the tactical principles that had enabled her successful mission. The questions they asked reflected genuine professional interest rather than the polite skepticism she had encountered during her administrative assignment. Lieutenant Chun, the young pilot who had previously sought Maria's unofficial tactical advice, approached with an expression that mixed relief with excitement about future training opportunities. "Major Santos, does this mean we'll finally get instruction in the kind of tactical thinking you used this morning? The computer training we've been receiving doesn't teach us how to handle situations that don't match predetermined scenarios." Maria smiled at Chun's question, recognizing the enthusiasm of a pilot eager to develop skills that could prove essential for survival in combat environments. "Lieutenant, that's exactly what we're going to develop, training that teaches you to think like pilots rather than computers. You'll learn to read tactical situations, anticipate enemy actions, and adapt your approach when standard procedures prove inadequate." The conversation continued as more pilots gathered around Maria, creating an impromptu discussion of tactical principles and training methodologies that would have been impossible during her administrative exile. The morning's successful mission had transformed her from a marginalized critic of training policy into a recognized expert, whose input was actively sought by pilots eager to improve their tactical capabilities. General Hayes observed this informal gathering from across the room, her expression indicating satisfaction with the cultural shift that was already beginning to take place. The general's decision to assign Maria to a leadership role in training development represented more than recognition of individual expertise. It signaled institutional commitment to valuing tactical effectiveness over administrative convenience. As Maria prepared to leave the debriefing room and begin her new responsibilities, she reflected on the morning's events and their implications for her career and the broader Air Force community. A single successful mission had vindicated years of arguments about training methodology while providing practical proof that experience and adaptive thinking remained essential military capabilities despite technological advancement. The news of Maria's successful intercept mission spread through the Air Force community with the velocity that only truly significant events achieve in military organizations. Within hours of the debriefing session, pilots at bases across the country were discussing the tactical implications of an A-10 accomplishing what F-22 Raptors could not, while training commanders found themselves fielding questions about why their curricula didn't include the adaptive skills that had proven essential for mission success. The story took on additional significance as details emerged about the sophisticated nature of the surveillance operation that had been thwarted, elevating Maria's achievement from a training curiosity to a legitimate national security victory. General Patricia Hayes wasted no time in leveraging the momentum created by Maria's mission success to address broader institutional issues that had been festering within the Air Force training establishment. The General's office issued a directive that afternoon calling for an immediate, comprehensive review of pilot training effectiveness across all specialties, with specific emphasis on evaluating whether current methodologies adequately prepared aviators for the kind of adaptive challenges they were likely to encounter in operational environments. The directive created immediate upheaval within the training community as commanders who had built their careers on implementing standardized, technology-driven instruction suddenly found themselves required to justify their approaches in terms of actual tactical effectiveness rather than administrative efficiency. Many discovered that they possessed impressive statistics about training completion rates, test scores, and cost-effectiveness, but virtually no meaningful data about whether their graduates could perform successfully in unpredictable real-world scenarios. Lieutenant Colonel Williams found himself in the particularly uncomfortable position of having his signature training initiatives subjected to intense scrutiny by the same senior leadership that had previously praised his innovations. The artificial intelligence training system that he had promoted as the future of pilot education was now being evaluated by a review board that included Maria as a primary advisor, creating a reversal of authority relationships that he found professionally devastating. The AI training modules produce consistent results across multiple test scenarios. Williams argued during an emergency staff meeting called to address the implications of General Hayes's review directive. Captain Santos's success was individual improvisation that can't be systematically replicated through standardized instruction methods. His response revealed his fundamental inability to distinguish between training for predictable test scenarios and preparing pilots for unpredictable operational challenges. Colonel Davidson, who had initially shared Williams's preference for technology-driven solutions, found his perspective dramatically altered by witnessing the practical results of adaptive tactical thinking. Williams, the problem with your argument is that individual improvisation isn't actually individual when it's based on systematic tactical principles that can be taught. Major Santos didn't succeed through luck. She applied specific skills that we've apparently stopped teaching our pilots. The meeting continued for several hours as training staff attempted to reconcile their preferred administrative approaches with the tactical realities that Maria's mission had highlighted. The discussion revealed fundamental philosophical differences about the purpose of military training and whether efficiency metrics accurately reflected preparation for combat operations. Maria's new office in the Training Development Building reflected her dramatically changed status within the base hierarchy. Instead of the cramped administrative space she had previously occupied, she now worked from a large office with windows overlooking the flight line, equipped with secure communication systems and direct access to classified training databases. From installations throughout the Air Force, the walls displayed tactical maps, aircraft performance charts, and planning materials that reflected her new responsibility for developing comprehensive training reform initiatives. Her first official task involved analyzing training records and performance data from the past 5 years to identify patterns that correlated with operational success or failure in deployed environments. The data painted a disturbing picture of declining tactical adaptability among recent pilot graduates, with measurable increases in mission failures, aircraft losses, and pilot casualties that could be attributed to inadequate preparation for complex operational scenarios. The analysis revealed that pilots trained primarily through computer-based systems demonstrated superior performance on standardized tests and simulated scenarios, but significantly inferior performance when faced with situations that required rapid adaptation to unexpected circumstances. The correlation was particularly stark in data from combat deployments, where pilots with traditional instructor-led training consistently outperformed their computer-trained counterparts in mission effectiveness and survival rates. The numbers don't lie, Maria explained to General Hayes during their first formal meeting in her new role. Pilots who received traditional tactical instruction are 3 times more likely to complete complex missions successfully and 2 times less likely to suffer combat losses compared to graduates of standardized computer-based programs. She displayed charts and statistical analyses that supported her conclusions with mathematical precision that even advocates of algorithmic approaches couldn't dispute. General Hayes studied the data with the expression of a senior leader recognizing that institutional preferences had created quantifiable risks to both mission effectiveness and personnel safety. Major Santos, These statistics suggest that our pursuit of training efficiency has actually reduced pilot capability in ways that directly impact operational readiness. How quickly can we begin implementing corrective measures? Maria had anticipated the general's question and had already developed preliminary recommendations for training reforms that could be implemented without completely disrupting existing programs. Ma'am, we can begin immediately by integrating adaptive tactical exercises into current curricula. The computer-based systems can handle basic procedural instruction, but we need human instructors conducting unpredictable scenarios that teach pilots to think rather than simply follow predetermined responses. The recommendation represented a hybrid approach that acknowledged the administrative benefits of standardized training while addressing the tactical deficiencies that such training created. Maria's proposal would maintain efficiency gains, where appropriate, while restoring the human elements of instruction that developed critical thinking and adaptive capabilities. Implementation of the new training protocols began within days of General Hayes's approval, starting with pilot programs at 3 different bases that would serve as testing grounds for the reformed methodologies. Maria found herself traveling extensively to observe training exercises and provide guidance to instructors who were transitioning from standardized approaches to more flexible tactical education. The initial results exceeded even Maria's optimistic projections for improvement in pilot capability. Students who participated in the hybrid training programs demonstrated dramatically enhanced performance on exercises that required adaptive thinking and creative problem solving, while maintaining their proficiency in basic procedural skills that computer-based training handled effectively. Lieutenant Chun, who had been among the first pilots to participate in the reformed training program, exemplified the positive changes that adaptive instruction could produce. During a complex tactical exercise that presented multiple unexpected challenges, Chun successfully modified her approach 3 times in response to changing conditions, ultimately completing her mission despite equipment failures and threat parameters that didn't match any scenario in the standard training database. "The difference is incredible," Chun reported during a post-exercise debrief. "Instead of looking for predetermined solutions to tactical problems, I learned to analyze the situation and develop responses based on fundamental principles. When my primary plan failed, I had the confidence and skills to create alternatives, rather than simply hoping the textbook approach would somehow work." Qian's experience was replicated by dozens of other pilots who participated in the reformed training programs, creating a growing body of evidence that adaptive instruction produced more capable aviators without sacrificing the efficiency benefits of modern training technologies. The success stories began generating requests from commanders at other bases who wanted their pilots to receive similar tactical education. The transformation in training methodology also created unexpected changes in the relationships between instructors and students. Pilots who had previously viewed training as a series of boxes to check began approaching their education with genuine enthusiasm for developing skills that they recognized as essential for survival and mission success. Instructors found their roles evolving from deliverers of standardized content to tactical mentors who could share real-world experience and judgment. Master Sergeant Rodriguez observed these changes from his perspective in aircraft maintenance, noting improvements not just in pilot performance, but also in their attitudes toward their aircraft and missions. The pilots trained under Major Santos's new system treat their aircraft differently, he explained to visiting officials who were evaluating the program's effectiveness. They understand their machines as tactical tools rather than just transportation, and they're more likely to recognize when something isn't quite right during pre-flight inspections. Rodriguez's observations highlighted an important secondary benefit of adaptive training that hadn't been anticipated by program designers. Pilots who learned to think tactically also developed enhanced mechanical intuition and situational awareness that improved their effectiveness in all aspects of flight operations. Not just complex combat scenarios, the success of Maria's training reforms attracted attention from Air Force headquarters and other military branches that were experiencing similar challenges with pilot readiness and tactical adaptability. Delegations of senior officers began visiting Nellis to observe the reform training programs and evaluate their potential for implementation across the entire military aviation community. During one such visit, General Robert Chun, the Air Force Chief of Staff, spent an entire day observing training exercises and interviewing pilots who had participated in both traditional and reformed programs. His conclusions reflected the highest levels of military leadership, recognizing that training methodology had direct implications for national security and military effectiveness. What Major Santos has developed here represents more than improved pilot training, General Chun announced during a press conference that attracted national media attention. This is a return to fundamental military principles that recognize human judgment and adaptability as essential capabilities that technology can enhance but never replace. The General's endorsement provided institutional validation for Maria's approach that extended far beyond personal vindication to broader acceptance of tactical thinking as the essential military capability. The press coverage that followed highlighted her story as an example of how individual expertise could drive institutional change when supported by enlightened leadership. Williams, meanwhile, found his position within the training establishment increasingly untenable as evidence mounted that his preferred methodologies had created quantifiable deficiencies in pilot capability. His requests for reassignment to other duties were eventually approved, allowing him to pursue administrative roles where his organizational skills could be utilized without impacting tactical training. The transformation of Maria's professional circumstances from administrative exile to institutional leadership reflected broader changes in military culture that valued competence over conformity and results over rhetoric. Her success had demonstrated that challenging established procedures could be an act of professional responsibility rather than insubordination when those procedures created risks to mission effectiveness and personnel safety. As word of the training reforms spread throughout the military aviation community, Maria began receiving requests to develop similar programs for other aircraft types and mission specialties. The principles of adaptive thinking and tactical flexibility that had proven essential for pilot survival applied equally to other military occupations that required rapid decision-making under stress. The Inspector General's investigation that followed Maria's successful intercept mission and the subsequent revelations about pilot training deficiencies proved to be one of the most comprehensive reviews of military education policy in decades. Colonel Sarah Mitchell, a decorated combat veteran with extensive experience in institutional analysis, led a team of investigators who spent 3 months examining training records, interviewing personnel, and evaluating the systemic factors that had led to the documented decline in pilot tactical readiness. The investigation's scope extended far beyond the specific incidents at Nellis Air Force Base to encompass training programs across multiple installations and aircraft types. What investigators discovered was a pattern of administrative decisions that consistently prioritized measurable efficiency metrics over tactical effectiveness, creating institutional incentives that rewarded conformity to standardized procedures, while actively discouraging the kind of adaptive thinking that real combat operations required. The evidence suggests that training deficiencies at Nellis were symptomatic of broader institutional problems rather than isolated incidents of poor leadership, Colonel Mitchell explained during a briefing to senior Air Force officials. Similar patterns of declining tactical readiness have been documented at installations throughout the country, indicating systemic issues that require comprehensive institutional response. The investigation revealed that Lieutenant Colonel Williams's approach to training standardization had been replicated at numerous other bases, often with even more extreme emphasis on computer-based instruction and algorithmic decision-making. Commanders who had implemented similar programs had received recognition and career advancement based on their ability to reduce training costs and improve administrative metrics, creating institutional incentives that effectively penalize tactical innovation. More disturbing was the discovery that concerns about training effectiveness had been raised by combat veterans at multiple installations but had been consistently dismissed or suppressed by commanders who viewed such criticism as resistance to modernization. The investigation documented dozens of cases where experienced pilots had attempted to warn their leadership about declining pilot readiness, only to face the same kind of professional marginalization that Maria had experienced. The investigation's findings were particularly damning regarding the institutional culture that had developed around questioning authority and challenging established procedures. Personnel interviews revealed widespread fear among mid-level officers about expressing concerns that might be interpreted as criticism of approved policies, creating an environment where potentially critical safety and effectiveness issues went unreported. The evidence indicates that institutional culture had evolved to treat expertise as a potential threat to administrative efficiency rather than as an essential military capability, Colonel Mitchell reported. Personnel with combat experience and tactical knowledge were systematically marginalized if their expertise conflicted with preferred administrative approaches. The documentation was extensive and irrefutable. Training records showed measurable declines in pilot performance on exercises that required adaptive thinking, while deployment reports indicated increased casualty rates and mission failures among pilots trained primarily through standardized computer-based systems. The correlation between training methodology and operational effectiveness was so clear that even the most dedicated advocates of technological solutions could not dispute the evidence. General Hayes found herself in the uncomfortable position of explaining to Pentagon officials how institutional preferences for training efficiency had created quantifiable risks in national security and military effectiveness. The briefing she conducted for senior leadership painted a disturbing picture of an organization that had lost sight of its fundamental mission while pursuing administrative objectives that had little relationship to combat readiness. We became so focused on measuring training inputs that we stopped evaluating training outputs, General Hayes acknowledged during testimony before a congressional subcommittee investigating military readiness. We measured completion times, test scores, and cost effectiveness, but we failed to assess whether our training was actually preparing pilots for the tactical challenges they would face in operational environments. The congressional hearings that followed brought national attention to the broader implications of Maria's story and the institutional failures that her success had exposed. Media coverage focused on the dramatic contrast between her initial marginalization and subsequent vindication, but also highlighted the systemic issues that had allowed such problems to develop and persist throughout the military training establishment. Representative Jennifer Walsh, a former Air Force officer who chaired the House Subcommittee on Military Personnel, used the hearings to explore broader questions about military culture and institutional accountability. Major Santos's experience raises fundamental questions about how our military institutions respond to expertise and whether we've created environments that discourage the kind of innovative thinking that effective military operations require. The hearings revealed that Maria's experience was not unique but rather representative of broader patterns affecting military personnel who possessed specialized knowledge that conflicted with institutional preferences. Witnesses testified about similar cases in other branches of the military, where combat veterans had been marginalized for challenging training methodologies, equipment decisions, or operational procedures that they believed compromised mission effectiveness. The institutional response to these revelations was swift and comprehensive. Secretary of Defense Patricia Hayes announced immediate implementation of new policies, requiring regular evaluation of training effectiveness based on operational outcomes rather than administrative metrics. Military education programs across all branches would be required to demonstrate measurable improvements in tactical readiness rather than simply meeting efficiency targets. We will no longer accept training programs that produce impressive statistics while failing to prepare our personnel for the realities they will face in operational environments, Secretary Hayes declared during a Pentagon press conference. Military effectiveness must be our primary measure of training success, with administrative efficiency serving that objective rather than replacing it. The policy changes included specific protections for military personnel who raised concerns about training effectiveness or operational readiness, creating formal channels for reporting problems without fear of career retaliation. The new procedures were designed to ensure that expertise and experience would be valued and utilized regardless of whether they aligned with institutional preferences or challenged established procedures. Maria found herself at the center of these institutional reforms, serving as a primary advisor to senior leadership on developing improved training methodologies and institutional cultures that valued tactical competence over administrative conformity. Her new responsibilities included overseeing implementation of adaptive training programs across all air force installations and developing evaluation criteria that measured real-world effectiveness rather than theoretical compliance. The transformation of her role from marginalized critic to institutional leader reflected broader changes in military culture that recognized expertise as an essential military capability rather than a potential administrative inconvenience. Her success had demonstrated that challenging established procedures could be an act of professional responsibility when those procedures created risks to mission effectiveness and personnel safety. Lieutenant Colonel Williams faced formal disciplinary action for his role in implementing training programs that had demonstrably reduced pilot tactical readiness while suppressing legitimate concerns about their effectiveness. The investigation revealed that he had been repeatedly warned about declining pilot performance but had dismissed those warnings in favor of maintaining administrative metrics that supported his career advancement. Williams's case became a cautionary example of how institutional incentives could encourage behavior that served individual career interests while compromising military effectiveness. His removal from training responsibilities and subsequent reassignment to administrative duties sent a clear message that the military would no longer tolerate leadership approaches that prioritized personal advancement over mission readiness. Broader institutional reforms extended beyond individual accountability to encompass fundamental changes in how military organizations evaluated performance and made promotion decisions. New criteria emphasized tactical competence and operational effectiveness rather than simply administrative efficiency, creating incentives for leaders to develop and utilize expertise rather than suppress it. Colonel Martinez, who had witnessed Maria's professional journey from administrative exile to institutional leadership, reflected on the broader implications of the institutional changes that had resulted from her courage in challenging established procedures. Maria's willingness to speak truth to power when lives were at stake demonstrated the kind of moral courage that military leadership requires, Martinez observed. Her vindication has created institutional space for other personnel to contribute their expertise without fear of professional retaliation. The cultural changes extended throughout the military aviation community as personnel, who had previously remained silent about training deficiencies, began contributing their expertise to improve institutional effectiveness. Combat veterans who had been marginalized for questioning established procedures found themselves sought out for their tactical knowledge and operational experience. Master Sergeant Rodriguez noted the transformation in relationships between senior and junior personnel as the institutional culture evolved to value expertise over hierarchy. People are finally talking to each other about what actually works rather than what they're supposed to say works, he observed. The pilots are learning from the maintainers. The instructors are learning from the students, and everybody's focused on making sure our people come home alive. The investigation's final report became required reading at military education institutions throughout the country, serving as a case study in institutional failure and recovery that highlighted the importance of maintaining cultures that valued competence and encouraged constructive dissent. Maria's story was featured prominently as an example of how individual courage could drive institutional change when supported by enlightened leadership. The report's recommendations led to permanent changes in military personnel policies, training, methodologies, and institutional accountability measures that were designed to prevent similar problems from developing in the future. The reforms represented acknowledgement that military effectiveness required continuous adaptation and improvement based on operational experience rather than rigid adherence to established procedures. As the investigation concluded and institutional reforms were implemented, Maria found herself recognized not just as a skilled pilot who had succeeded in a challenging mission, but as a catalyst for broader institutional improvements that would benefit military personnel and national security for years to come. Her willingness to challenge established procedures despite personal risk had demonstrated the kind of moral courage that effective military institutions required from their personnel. The transformation of her professional circumstances from administrative punishment to institutional leadership reflected the military's capacity for self-correction when confronted with clear evidence of systemic problems. Her success had proven that expertise and tactical thinking remained essential military capabilities, regardless of technological advancement or administrative preferences. 2 years later, Major Maria Santos stood before a packed auditorium at the Air Force Academy, addressing the newest generation of pilot candidates. The same aircraft that had once been mocked as obsolete, her beloved A-10 sat proudly displayed outside the building, now recognized as a symbol of tactical adaptability and proven effectiveness. Your generation will face challenges we can't predict using tools we haven't invented yet, Maria told the eager faces before her. But the principles that saved lives that morning in Nevada haven't changed. Expertise matters, experience counts, and sometimes the courage to challenge the system is the highest form of military service. The Academy had renamed its tactical training facility the Santos Center for Adaptive Aviation, where every pilot learned both cutting-edge technology and time-tested tactical thinking. Computer simulations worked alongside veteran instructors, creating warriors who could think creatively under pressure. Lieutenant Chun, now an instructor herself, often shared Maria's story with new students. She proved that one person with courage and competence can change an entire institution. Chun would say, "Never let anyone convince you that your expertise doesn't matter." The reforms Maria championed had spread throughout the military, saving countless lives and improving mission effectiveness across all branches. Her willingness to risk everything for what she knew was right had transformed not just pilot training, but military culture itself. As Maria concluded her address, the future pilots rose in thunderous applause. Outside, the rumble of aircraft engines reminded everyone that somewhere, pilots trained under her reformed methods were protecting freedom with skills that balanced innovation with wisdom. If this story of courage against conformity inspired you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and join our community of everyday heroes. Share this video with someone who needs to remember that expertise and integrity always matter, no matter what the system says. What challenges are you facing that require Maria's kind of courage? Drop a comment below. We read every single one. Until next time, keep fighting for what's right.